meeting back to order. My name is Dale Nelson. I serve as the president of the Red Lake Watershed Board, represent Pennington County. I'd like to introduce our board here when I get done, but the one thing I want to emphasize tonight, this is an informational meeting. We don't do any voting. We don't do anything, taking anything off, anything on. This is strictly information, and this is information that this board gathers, and we go back. This has not been established as a project. There's not a project number on it. We spent very limited amount of money to get to this point. This is the things that we do to try to get to see what the people feel about any of this thing before we ever move any further. So there's no project on it yet. There's nothing going. So it's a limited amount of information which Nate will share with you, but I'd like to start down here at the end with our officer.
Leroy Osea from Marshall County.
Albert Graham from East Polk County.
I'm Gene Tiedemann. I'm a farmer from Euclid. I represent West Polk County.
Lee Cole, representing Beltrami County.
Les Torgerson from Clearwater County.
Orville Knott from Red Lake County.
Okay, tonight we're going to start out by having Nate do a presentation. I guess we didn't talk much about this, Nate, but I think you'll do your presentation. We'll open it up for questions. We'd like this done in an orderly manner. Whoever's the loudest doesn't going to get the most attention here. We'd like everybody who wants to speak, because that's how we absorb our information. So it'll be taken that way, and we're happy to got a turnout here tonight. And Nate, I think I'll turn it over to you at this point.
All right.
Thank you, Dale. What I'm going to present to you tonight is really an overview of this district's distributed detention study. It's a study of possible retention sites that the Red River Watershed Management Board sponsored on the Minnesota side of the Red River Basin. That does apply, of course, to the Pine Lake area as well. We'll get into some of the specifics, but basically, this is informational regarding how we could possibly start to solve flooding problems, not only locally, but on the Red River main stem, and the study that supports that. So there's an organization called the Basin Commission, and they represent several states, even a province. In working with watershed districts like the Red Lake Watershed, they've come up with a goal on a basin-wide basis of reducing main stem peak flows on the Red River by 20%. In order to do that, that's going to take a tremendous effort on everybody's part to try and share in that slowing down of the water through many different means. What it means for Red Lake is that at Crookston, there's a gauge in Crookston. That's where that river is measured. And you have to reduce the peak flow of Crookston by 35%.
Say, Nate.
Yes.
Could you chance that without that microphone? That's kind of almost an irritating.
All right. Is it better down here?
Can everybody hear without that? Would that be better? Give it a try, Nate.
All right. Well, I will need it for this video.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Or turn it down, yeah, one or the other.
Yeah, well.
There, we can hear you.
Okay, so that's the goal, is this major reduction at a point of measure that everyone can go on the internet and find that gauge. That's at Crookston. And that will be for a flood on the magnitude of what we like to refer to the 1997 flood as like a big flood that most people experienced. That's the type of reduction that it's going to take in the Red Lake watershed to affect that kind of change on the Red River itself, downstream. Here you can see where the Red Lake watershed fits into the overall basin perspective. You can see that on the Minnesota side, that's a pretty big chunk of the Minnesota side of the Red River Basin, and quite frankly, it's about 6,000 square miles, so you can see how Red Lake fits into the overall picture of the Red River Basin. With respect then to this study and the Red Lake Watershed District, this is a map of the district where the green shaded areas are areas that already have some form of retention or detention or water runoff control. I'll give you a real obvious one here. The Red Lake Dam, you can see Red Lakes here. That whole area has some form of retention. There's a dam at Red Lake and so forth. Up here is Agassiz and Thief Lake and so on. These are areas that have already been built with retention, and then you can see since that 97 flood, the Red Lake has done some projects here north of Crookston as well to move towards that overall goal of flood damage reduction. Historically then, and some of this was done by federal partners as well, like the Fish and Wildlife and the Corps of Engineers. Before 1997, there was about 231,000 acre-feet of constructed storage in this watershed district. And then since 1997, they've done about 8,650. So right now, they're already operating with a substantial amount of retention in this large district. And that number does not include Red Lakes. Red Lakes is a whole other issue, but it's just to kind of give you some perspective on what the district has done to date. When we did the study then, what we did was, I don't know if a lot of you have heard of LIDAR. It's where they came and they determined elevations across the landscape. And anyone can do this from a home computer now, anywhere in the state of Minnesota, and quite frankly, the Red River Basin. And you can get land elevations within 6-inch accuracy all over this area. And so what we did was we took that tool and we identified depressional areas and areas where water could be stored. Okay? It doesn't mean that that's necessarily each site is a good place to store water, but we have the tools then to develop drainage areas and then an area that can store 3 to 4 inches of runoff. Okay? So across the entire district, I could produce a map that would show you literally hundreds of sites that could store water. Again, that doesn't have anything to do with land ownership, land use. It's just merely where topographically could water be stored. And we had a big rain here on was it Monday night? Yeah, Monday night. 3 to 4 inches of rain. It came so fast that probably 2/3 to 3/4 of that water ran off, just to give you an idea. Typically, if you get a 3-inch rain over, let's say, 24 hours, only about an inch of that's going to run off. Because the rest of that's going to soak into the ground, go to the low areas, the wetlands, the lakes. Well, the storm we just had this week, and I don't know quite what happened here at Pine Lake, but sites that we're looking at for storage could contain 3 to 4 inches of runoff. That's a big event. That's probably on the order of a 100-year storm. Okay, what this map shows then is, based on our modeling, areas within the district where a person, if you were to do retention, where would you target, where would you start to look first? Where would be your best value for retention in terms of reducing then the peak flows and volumes of Crookston? And it's based on color. So the hotter colors, the reds, those are your, shall we say, lesser productive areas for retention, and then you get into the cooler colors, the yellows and the blues. If you really want to target the effect at Crookston and reducing peak flows at Crookston, this model helps guide us in our site selection. And so to give you an example, this is Red Lake. Well, that's already kind of taken care of. It kind of tells the story there. And then of course down here, you're down towards Crookston. You're in what we call an early area where you kind of want to just let that water go early out ahead of any flood that might be coming. Incidentally, if you have questions, just raise your hand. There's no time like the present to have an interactive discussion, so you're welcome to ask questions. Okay, so then through this study, what we did was we came up with, I mentioned these sites, we came up with generalized areas and watersheds where we felt there was still viable topographical areas where you could store water in the Red Lake Watershed District. So the green hatch is those existing areas that are kind of under some form of control. And then what you have left are these yellow shaded drainage areas that you could still find feasible sites and store water, retain it during a flood, before a flood, and after, to help reduce flows downstream. And what it ends up looking like in a more generalized map is there's kind of 4 areas of the district that still have viable retention. Here's Thief River Falls up here, so you've got west of there, southeast of Crookston, of course the Don Pine Lake area, and then north and east of Thief River Falls as well, where there's still depressional areas and the ability to store water if you were to choose that and move in that direction. These are simply the topography lends itself. Again, it doesn't have respect to land use necessarily. and it's just very preliminary. Trent?
How many days do you have for projected for water from Pine Lake to get to
The travel time?
Crookston? Yes.
The travel time, I'm maybe not able to answer that right off the cuff. You mean just a drop of water?
Well, I mean, in the flood, I mean, it must be, when it's early, middle, and late, it's in the middle, how many days you figure it takes to get there?
Maybe I can answer that later in the presentation, but I'm kind of not quite up to speed on the precise number of days. It's probably on the order of a week. Yes, sir.
Yeah, what did IWI stand for again?
That's the International Water Institute.
Okay.
That's the kind of the organization that got the LiDAR done. They got federal grant monies in place. And if you want to know this website where you can do the LiDAR on your own, we'll let you know after the meeting. We can probably put it up on the screen here, but it's very user-friendly and accessible.
How do you spell LiDAR?
LIDAR. If you were to put in like IWI LiDAR Basin viewer, Google would take you there. Okay, so we got to the numbers then of what could happen in the Red Lake Watershed District if you were to try to meet those goals. And what we found, and just focus on these two red numbers here. Remember, the goal was 35% peak flow reduction was the goal. Well, based on our topographic analysis, we found that we really could probably only get to 18% peak flow reduction in Crookston with constructed distributed sites on the landscape. Meaning, to get to that 35%, we would actually have to do main stem dams like that on the Red Lake River at Hewitt is one that's been talked about in the past. And I guess the reason I point that out is these are lofty goals. These are admirable goals, but they are also bound by reality and what the landscape will offer us. So that's really the conclusion is you can't get to 35% reduction at Crookston simply by building impoundments spotted across the landscape. You have to even get more serious about slowing the water down on the main stem. And that's what this looks like then. If you were to look at the Red Lake River at Crookston for a particular event, this is a hydrograph. This is a measurement of the river, time across the bottom, flow on the vertical axis. So for this particular event, which is a large spring-type flood, this is what the river would do today. You would almost get to 35,000 CFS at Crookston. With those constructed storage sites built all over the landscape in the watershed district, you could achieve this kind of a reduction here, this 18% reduction, and to get down to the actual goal of the 35% reduction at Crookston, you would have to do that main stem storage. So this is just kind of a relative measure of what we're talking about and what it would take. And this board, they have a history of this kind of retention, and you know, it's just one of the things that they do as their water management strategy. Okay, well, how do you develop a retention project then? This is kind of the issue for tonight and going forward is how easy is it, how complicated is it? And we've got a little video to explain some of that.
Since 1998, people in the basin have worked together to build solutions on the remediation process. This process has clear goals for flood damage reduction and natural resource enhancement. After 10 years, this work is bearing fruit. A primary approach in reducing flood damage is to strategically hold water where it falls by creating impoundments.
I guess suffice it to say, it takes a very significant collaborative effort. It doesn't just start with a board like this or an engineering firm or landowners. It takes absolutely all stakeholders, including agencies, federal, state, and local, to move any sort of project concept forward. This is not done in a vacuum. It is not done in a heavy-handed fashion. It is done collaboratively in what we like to call a project team process, where you take the idea of a problem and then you look at solutions and try to solve them in that fashion. And so, as an example, this is an impoundment. You're going to see all these different pictures of impoundments holding water. This was done up northeast of Roseau, Minnesota. Took about 20 years to develop this particular project. And through the project team process, it was funded and built in about 3. Recently, in 2013, it was completed. It's an example of the old way of doing business versus the project team process and kind of working together collaboratively. It's a consensus-based process, which means it's not a majority rules, you don't vote, you do things that you can live with. So everyone around the table can accept the outcome. So can you live with it is kind of the question. It typically involves bi-monthly meetings with the watershed district as the leader. There are sometimes subcommittees to deal with difficult issues or real specific issues that require special expertise. And in this case, the Brand Angus impoundment, which is up there near south of Warren, Minnesota, that was completed again in about 2013, and that utilized federal money through the NRCS, as well as environmental enhancement features to make the project suitable for landowners and the permitting agencies. I think if you get the Fargo News over here, you probably heard real recently that a certain amount of money has been allocated for the Red River Basin for retention through the farm program. So a lot of these future projects that are going to be developed going forward from today are going to be utilizing this, I call it NRCS money, but it's really farm program money, working with landowners as well as, and I'll point it out again, you can't just store water and call it good. You have to do enhancements. You have to make the project actually better for all concerned landowners, the environment, permitting. It's really a holistic process in that sense.
I'm standing on the western embankment of the Grand Impoundment, located approximately 14 miles north of Crookston, Minnesota. This project was constructed as part of the flood damage reduction effort in the valley to help alleviate flooding downstream.
The watershed approached me about 3 years ago to see if I would be interested in letting them use this piece of property for their impoundment. Downstream flooding that was going on, and we tried to alleviate some of that flooding, and this was one of the sites they had picked to store some water. This spring, this whole area was underwater. We just about maxed out the capacity of the impoundment because there was about within inches maybe going over the spillway.
This impoundment covers approximately 490 acres, and it stores approximately 3,900 acre-feet of water. We visualize the Grand Impoundment as a large bathtub. The water fills up in this bathtub, and you ultimately come down to the outlet structure, which is what you're looking at right now, and you open the gate, just like you would to drain on your bathtub, and you drain it down slowly.
Okay, so when you establish projects like this, one of the things you have to come up with is the purpose and need. Why are you here? You know, the project statement for any particular retention site that we might consider. And then you look at a whole host of alternatives, ultimately, that kind of support and feed into the selected alternative. And I want to emphasize, as far as tonight's meeting and on Pine Lake and that broad subject, none of this has occurred. I mean, this is a very preliminary discussion point at this point. The meeting that was held in, I don't even remember when it was, I think it was in May or June, was printed, presented as such, and there were some concepts, but again, there hasn't been a project team even established, so if anything were to move forward at Pine Lake, it would include all these processes and these steps to eventually develop some sort of a focus. Okay, this project that Myron was just talking about in the video, this was a impoundment that was built on a stream, on channel. It did require 60 acres of mitigation, and to this day, it's kind of an environmental mecca. This particular grant impoundment, the landowner still retains the ownership, and Myron might talk about that a little bit later. I mean, these projects can be acquired in many different ways: flowage easement, outright fee title acquisition. Government farm programs can weigh in on ownership, and so you can either choose to have a tax base or not. There's really no hard and fast way that these projects are developed, but for sure, all the lands and the impacts are compensated as part of the project development. This particular project was upstream of the city of Euclid, Minnesota, and these projects do and are designed to provide local flood damage reduction. It's not just about the 20% reduction strategy. That is certainly a driving force for this board, but ultimately, if you can't show local benefits, you're going to have a tough time meeting all the objectives and everything that's needed. And that's what it says here. Projects must greatly reduce local problems, as well as the larger issues downstream. And then, of course, here, landowner buy-in is a must for these projects to be successful. Okay, just kind of wrapping up here then, typically, if you're going to do retention these days, you're going to need 3 to 5 funding sources. Some of the sources that are kind of common to all these projects are watershed district funds, Red River Watershed Management Board funds, state FDR funds, and flood damage reduction grant program. And now we're getting into the SAR outdoor heritage funds, we're getting into NRCS funds, and there's typically a whole host of partners that have to come to bear in order to fund these relatively expensive projects in terms of construction. Okay? And if you want to get it permitted, again, you're going to have to restore things, you're going to have to make it better than what's there, if possible. So instead of jumping, well, I'll take questions right now, and then I'm just going to talk specific to my sir, I got a question.
The landowner that is pouring water, standing in the soybean field, are you proposing them to store water in the spring runoff? Or is the project looking to store water in a big rain event for the summertime? Obviously, you're not storing on all the and flooding the soybean field.
Right, my role takes that.
This particular landowner had 450 some acres in the soil watershed district, or he actually kept ownership. We have a flows and floods land. This land is used for spring floods or summer floods. What he did in the lower elevations of the impoundment was put it into a farm program, as a conservation reserve program, so put it in the CRP. He farms the higher elevations, which is in the 50 or 100-year flow event. So to answer your question, that same field is in soybeans or wheat or sugar beets today. Now, he farms at his own risk, and we just had, so far in 2014, that impoundment's been full 1.5 times. And that's just this year. Since 2008, it only got filled once during the summer. So, and I called him on the way to Gary, Minnesota for a discussion with landowners, and I called him to ask him what damages he's seen on that field so far with this flood event, and he said he's had about 15% crop loss so far on the areas that he's farming. As I was driving to Gary, I see way more fields with bigger than 15% damages, and they were in impoundments. But his higher elevations is what he's farming. He's farming today, and he's farming now.
You do have the right, if some huge rain event, you could flood everything.
That's correct. If it was a 100-year event, in that particular case, a 100-year flow event would flood that field. It was almost going over the emergency spillway in 2010, and we flooded, I think, about 20% of his field then. But he still, we've got to remember, he was compensated full value for the land, he's farming it. After, we basically paid for it, but he gets to keep the land because he wanted to use it for hunting as well. He wanted to hand it over, because that was ag and now it's hunting. And like David mentioned, this gets into a real mecca for wildlife, whether it's upland or fish. Because on these impoundments, in this particular case, there's holes 35 feet deep and they retain fish. So, he has both, but he's not fishing, he doesn't like to hunt. So we want to keep the land, but yeah, so they are farmed. We have 3 impoundments in the Red River Valley right now, where the one is running a couple hundred acres of still farmland on it. The one is 100 and some acres, and in this particular case, he's got probably 80 or more that he's farming. where he's physically tilling. The other parts maybe have CRP contracts.
Could you give an example of the costs of what we retained it at?
Yeah, what happens, if we're gonna ask a landowner, do you wanna sell the land, we have it appraised, number one. It has to be appraised, and then, we give them a fair market value price for it, or a negotiated price, if they wanna, sell it to you. If you wanna retain ownership, obviously the fee is less. So in this case, he took less money to keep the land, so that he can have it for future generations instead of
And
ownership.
then that does not allow other people to hunt or fish on that
Absolutely,
property?
he has his own refuge. So his wildlife area is his. It's not open to public hunting just because we have a flow easement. We only have a flow easement to flood it. We don't have the right to let someone go out and hunt on it. If the watershed district bought the land, we have typically opened that up for public hunting because public money all paid for it.
How about the tax base?
In the particular case of the landowners who keep the land, if it's an agricultural use, the county still retain agricultural land values. So if it's in CRP, he's got it in the agricultural program, it's still deemed agriculture. We had one impoundment that might be too close. We had one impoundment that was in CRP, and then it came out. And then the county reduced it because it lost its farm program capabilities. Now it was just no different than the woods. So they changed the market value, taxable market value based on land use. And that's how the counties handle it. You can also do a lieu of tax, where if the watershed district buys the land from the landowner and it gets taken off the tax base, you can also set up a program that pays the counties lump sum fee for taxes for the future. And I know some watershed districts do that. But typically, the projects that we built are still on the tax roll because the landowner that we did buy land from, they had 160 acres, and we bought the land from them. They rented it back to us to retain the CRP portion of the project. So they got paid for their land, but they rented it from us, so we charged them a rental rate. They have it in CRP, and they still get the CRP money. Any other questions on land?
Do you do any digging or anything on these, or are they just natural elevations? Like in that situation
Okay,
there?
I'll give you this example right now. This is 1 mile. From here to about here, and from here to here is 1 mile.
So did you do any excavating?
Oh yeah, this is an 18-foot dike.
Okay.
In this is a 2010 flood event. 10 inches of rain in 2 events upstream of these farm fields. They had a half an inch right here. They had 10 inches in 2 events. This is 26 square miles that comes into this impoundment. So we store it, wait till, in this case, there was no water here because they didn't get any rain. So then we can just meter it through this channel at a slower rate and draw it down. It takes a while to draw it down because this particular flood event this is where you have about 20% crop loss in this field. But this was a big one.
Myron, I was going to say, when you said there's places where there's 35 feet of water there, that's the borrow pits.
Right,
When they got the
exactly.
clay for the dikes, they aren't that big, but they hold water after the impoundment is in.
The particular 35-foot borrow pit that you got to make to make an 18-foot embankment, that 35-foot pit is right here. And that's the deepest one. Then we have few out in here, and we created some wetlands back over in these areas for these borrow pits. But these are flat elevations, so in this particular piece, there's probably 15 foot of fall in 1 mile. So we have a 15-foot or 18-foot dike here, and it turns into 0 as you get upstream. Terry, do you have a question?
How do you deal with the loss of mature trees, from 20 to 200-year-old trees that I had, concern about?
We have an impoundment, it's called, and this is one too, but we have an impoundment it's called Parnell. It's been in effect since 1998. There was a shelter built in Parnell at the deepest part of the impoundment. Those trees are still alive. They're now going through the cycle where all shelter belts do, that they die. And this is a concern of summer flooding. Winter flooding or in the spring, trees are dormant. They can handle water on them. And you get it down before the tree starts starting its spring growth. This is, when they're starting to take in water, when they're not dormant, so to speak, that's when they get threatened to die. And these, I'm not gonna lie to you, these particular trees are, you get in danger of being damaged if water's on in the rock time.
I don't think this one's lost.
It is, yeah, this is the third event of this year where water's been
There's
on.
big oaks in there and all.
How long did you hold the water?
At least 38 days. It was close to 30 days before we got it down, and about 2 weeks. It was, our goal is to get it down in 30 days. In 2010, it was longer than 30 days to get it down. This year, we just got this impoundment down in July, and now we got this 4-inch rain, and we're gonna be starting again. So it depends on you. This year, we're probably never gonna get it all down. Right now, that we were just out at the site day before yesterday, the water's coming in, creating after 4 inches of rain, 4.5 inches of rain upstream here. The water's already to this elevation. So we anticipated, getting right back to here again.
What happens, I got a copy of that first meeting map you had on the affected areas from the dams. If you don't get easements from the affected landowners, what happens?
You mean on just a concept project?
Well, I mean, I got in this first printout at the meeting earlier, shows the 3 dams and shows where the water's going to back up, or theoretically back up, and what landowners it'll directly affect. If you don't get easements from those landowners, does the project still go ahead?
In order for a project to proceed, you have to retain or make sure damages are paid to all landowners that it's going to flow. You have to have flow easements from them, and then, we've been very lucky that we've had cooperating landowners for projects that we've had some that aren't. But any project that we have, you have to have landowner, we have to have a contract with the landowner, whether it's a flow easement, whether we purchase the land, and if you don't, then we have to figure out through the project team method, through what scenarios, if that project is that important in that area, or can we reduce it, can we scale it down? That all gets worked out.
But that's not what I'm asking. What I'm asking is, can you just go ahead and do it?
You mean eminent domain?
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I'm asking. You can't.
Yeah.
So you can run right over the land.
It might be good to share how much, for the 17 years I've been here, I think Vernon was with me then, I think we did 2 acres in the city of Bagley for a storm sewer drainage.
Since I've been with the watershed district, we've never been in a full condemnation proceeding. We've started 2. One was at the Bagley project, and one was for this woods right here. That woods was owned from a guy from Orfino, Idaho, who inherited it from his dead uncle. Never seen it since 1970 something, but all of a sudden it was very valuable when we were to do this project. So he really inflated the price. We made him an offer. He didn't get back to us, never got back to us, so we sent him a letter that we were probably going to proceed with eminent domain. And when we proceed with eminent domain, our offer is off the table. And then we just go to court, let the courts decide what the probably price of the land is, and we pay them what the courts say. We offered him a pretty good money for that 11 acres. He finally got back to us and accepted our offer to go through eminent domain. So there are tools at the board's disposal that you can, proceed with eminent domain. I mean, that's just the reality of it. And the state law allows that.
You can also retain ownership. You can also, 10 years down the road from now, if you decide to sell, you can still sell the land for what you can get for it, but the easement has to go along with the land.
There are some more slides that you wanted to.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions on logistics of an impoundment or?
Yes, I was reading a form about the Red River diversion project in Fargo, and they had to flood some wetlands, and the diversion board was not happy because they had to pay a substantial fee to mitigate those wetlands. Is that also something that happens?
Absolutely. We have to comply with all federal and state permitting laws. This particular project, we mitigated 60 acres of, because of this was an on-channel impoundment site, and on-channel, it was not a protected waters. This was not a protected waters, which helped from a standpoint of permitting from the state. However, it doesn't relinquish the fact that the Army Corps of Engineers or other entities don't, that are permitting this particular project, you have to compensate for wetland loss. So wetland vegetation they deemed is this areas in here. So we had to mitigate 60 acres of wetlands, and we had to make another wetland, we had to do some more mitigation in these areas too. For the proposed damages we were going to do, we still haven't done any damages, this is 6 years later, but we still had to mitigate for the damages that may occur. And to date, we've only increased wetlands just from all the borrow pits we've had, just from the land going from out of farming production to non-farm. By nature, this land's gonna turn into wetland habitat, and it has, but we get no credit for that, because they just look at, here's what we think you're gonna damage, you gotta replace it over here, and then whatever cost it takes, you do it. And then you don't get to go back 10 years later and say, see, we didn't wreck this, can we get our money back? No, that's not the case. They got their cake and eat it too when it comes to that. So the environmental groups definitely take care of their needs on these types of projects, and that's why the state helps pay for these projects, because the natural resource enhancements that come with it. So, to answer your question is, we have to comply with all state and federal laws.
And then on that 60 acres, your preferred method would be to, rather than pay for the mitigation, you would develop another wetland that would be equal to that same quantity of acres.
Right, or you can take it out of the wetland banks now. They have wetland banks, and you could
try that.
Yep, yep, that's expensive too. So this particular project costs over $100,000 in wetland mitigation costs. Or you can go to, in this particular county, each wetland acre is $12,149 per acre if you're going to buy it out of a bank. So you would, for 60 acres, you'd be paying $12,149 an acre for wetland mitigation costs. Okay, we'll have Nate continue, but think more questions, guys and girls.
Okay, I did have some slides specific to Pine Lake, but one thing I mentioned it earlier, wanted to point out, this project, as part of the project development, also included restoration of this channel. You can see that originally it was a straight ditch, this line here. And so what we did is we came in and brought the sinuosity, kind of the natural form of the stream, back to that outlet for this project, and then we put in setback levees because the landowner had historically had damage, the stream was unmaintainable, and so all of these projects have these elements of restoration and enhancement that help really mitigate any impacts that there may be. So specifically to a meeting we had earlier that was announced, we talked about a couple of alternatives for Pine Lake and the downstream retention study. So I wanted to just touch on modify the outlet of Pine Lake to deal with some of their water level issues, and then the whole upstream storage concept upstream of Pine Lake, which a lot of you are interested in. Well, specifically, this modification of the Pine Lake outlet would allow the lake to be better managed at a little bit of a higher level, such that you basically would have more water that could evaporate, so that in a dry year it just doesn't get so low. Like I think last year the lake got really low as an example. Modification of this outlet would give the lake, and the district, as the watershed manages Pine Lake as a project, more options to manage lake levels, okay? But this option here doesn't really have flood damage reduction impacts downstream. There's not a lot of storage on Pine Lake given what goes on with the outlet. So that's certainly a benefit to Pine Lake, but probably not a benefit to downstream flood damage reduction all the way to the Red River. So then we got to this map here, and again, I said I could produce this map for anywhere in the watershed district, and that's a fact. Topographically, there are just certain areas where water will hold with or without the help of a road or a dam or some other features. And then, of course, you need a drainage area upstream. And what's interesting about the Pine Lake watershed is it's very steep. First of all, it's about 45 square miles, and this upper reach of, and that would be to the south, of the Pine Lake watershed, it drops tens of feet, and you couldn't really store water in those locations because the water is just coming off those hills that a lot of you know of, and there's really no opportunities. So topographically, then you end up with this 1, 2, and 3, and that's literally the extent of the development of those sites. The features of those sites, whether you would have 2 dams, 3 dams, 1 dam, an outlet, an inlet, diversion channels, whether you use the road as your dam, or and how it would affect individual landowners. None of that work has been done. None of that feasibility has been done. So, in all 3 cases, that blue hatched area, that's one idea of if you just built a dam at this particular location, who would it impact? And like in the case of Site 1, apparently there's 16 to 20 different landowners that could be impacted by that particular project. And the same would apply to Site 2 and Site 3. And until the district would to proceed with some sort of feasibility study, some sort of engaging landowners on the particulars and the specifics, there's really no more information than that, other than to say these sites have the potential to add up to 11,000 or more acre feet of storage, which would have a tremendous benefit downstream. But in reality, a future project would probably have to be a combination of alternatives, and I kind of doubt you would build 12,000 acre feet of storage upstream of Pine Lake, but you could certainly fashion a project that could get towards that goal and be a meaningful project. But this was the map that was presented, and this came out of that distributed detention study. Are there any questions about this map?
So, before the Pine Lake Dam was built in 1980 for flood control, wasn't Pine Lake kind of doing what the upstream retention naturally? What is the low point on the Lost River as it exits the Pine Lake Dam? What is the lowest elevation?
Okay, well, the crest of the dam is at elevation 1283.5, 1283.5. So when I've stood there, I suppose the actual channel bottom at that location is about 1280. About 12, well, of course, if the beavers have built mud up there and whatnot, maybe 5 feet, so 1278. I mean, that could have been the pre-settlement outlet. But any natural lake, depending on how restricted the outlet is, will bounce and fill up and then slowly meter out. So, yeah, I mean, all lakes do naturally provide what's called ungated storage. You don't have an actual control there, but as it rushes in, the basin will fill up and then it will slowly flow out. So, yeah, I mean, sure, Pine Lake has some, even today, there's natural retention that occurs right now today. It's just that these studies are really designed to improve upon or, economize the efficiency of any particular site to improve that benefit. All right, so this is just an example of, because we modeled what if we did this retention and how would that affect things at Pine Lake. And this right here is the benefit of just doing the outlet. I remember I said earlier it was probably had a minimal flood damage reduction benefit. If we modify the outlet of Pine Lake, you have just a tiny, tiny reduction in those peak flows outletting Pine Lake, whereas any one of these impoundments upstream that would knock it down, bing, just like that. And that's really the order of magnitude and the relative comparison of each site. And I don't want to focus on whether one site is better than the other, because we're just not at that point. But if you literally built all 3 sites and you did that almost 12,000 acre feet of storage, you could get any sort of event upstream of Pine Lake, and it would basically, the lake would just stay stable because you'd be storing all that water upstream. So that's just kind of the order of magnitude of what you could do in an extreme sense. So you could really moderate fluctuation on Pine Lake with retention, but really, he's looking farther downstream is where the goal is, and that's contributing to the retention for the district.
How long would it take to meter out if you were to have them 3 retention ponds full? Meter that through the Pine Lake system?
Well, there's a couple of things we looked at. Typically, you want to hold water about 30 days so that the flood peaks downstream pass, and then you meter out. So that's about 30 days. But we also looked at then, in the case of Pine Lake, on one of these sites, you could possibly retain some water and basically have what's called flow augmentation, so that you maybe would let that out a little slower, so there'd be fresher water in the case of a drought. But I guess the short answer is 30 days is what you would typically hold it, and then pass it as conditions would allow.
But wouldn't your geographic location have an explanation too, and then they could, you know, like, a lot of times we'll have our trigger points at Grand Forks also, and we, you know, monitor the gates from that elevation, but timing also is a factor on when you're going to release your water. You know, if you're farther upstream than, say, the impoundment's 20 miles from the river, your release points could be different based on how long it takes for the water to get to the river.
Right. You would actually have an operating plan for any one of these projects that would look at downstream triggers. But the 30 days is still kind of the industry. It's just a round number, but it certainly wouldn't necessarily be more than that you would hold water.
And they would be dam safety measures that the state would require in the operation of these dams and the strength of these dams. That's fit with all the state criteria.
Right. Trent, do you have a question?
Well, is there a full week between that peak and peak at Grand Forks? Or at Crookston? It seems to me there was only about 3 days between the peak at Pine Lake and the peak.
Well, that's really your same question earlier.
No, but I mean, you had the Grand, or the Crookston gauge out there, or Grand Forks earlier.
Right.
And I don't have my glasses with me, so I can't read you.
But I don't have I'd have to have a.
But they're both 97 flood. So if you go back to
It's
your.
a simulated
But if you go
97
back-
flood.
Yeah, but if you go back to your simulated Grand Forks peak, isn't that just about the same time frame as Pine Lake?
They're completely arbitrarily different model event. You're talking about this right here?
Yeah.
Like that type of thing?
Yeah, that one's from the 21st to the 26th, and I thought that's about when the Crookston Grand Forks peak was.
That's hypothetical.
Well, but it's really hypothetical. I mean, you really can't give us the kind of apples and oranges comparison as far as the timing.
They're both 1997.
Right, but it's a theoretical example of what happened with that kind of volume of water.
That's what I was wondering about the timing when I asked you about how long it
But the difference between the peak of Pine Lake and the peak of Crookston, for example, is different than how long it takes for the water to travel between the two. I mean, they're somewhat, mutually exclusive phenomenon as well.
took. You're going to take the water off the peak here, you're going to infect it a week later. Correct?
Well,
When you start
this is-
storing.
What's the, where are you driving with the question, Trent?
Well, if it's gonna affect the flood in Grand Forks, it's gotta be timed so that it stores water at the right time.
Right.
And that's what I was just asking. I'm not trying to do anything other than find out if it's at the right time.
And that would come in the operating plan, that would definitely occur with the operating plan. It's the timing that you're referring to, and then when you actually have to store it. But you'd have to do a hydraulic model to determine what that time is, which we haven't done.
well, we have. It's just it's kind of such a site-specific question. But what this graphic does is, let's get into the meat of this then. What this means is, for the blue color is your maximum impact at Crookston, based on the expected change, reduction in peak flow at the Crookston gauge for each square mile detained in a subbasin. So for a square mile of runoff that you detain in these blue areas, you can have the greatest reduction in peak at Crookston up to 0.12%. So it's kind of, like I said, it's kind of the most efficient storage occurs in these bluer shades and the yellow shades. It's most efficient. Doesn't mean it's the only storage you should have. It's just, we all understand efficiencies. And this does correlate with the middle area. So this area of the Red Lake Watershed District, the blues and the yellows, contributes to the peak at Crookston to the greatest extent. How many days that is, we could get you that answer, but the models are telling us that these are the areas, if you want to reduce the peak, these are the places to slow it down.
Maybe the right answer would be you just don't know.
Today.
That'd be okay too, Nick. You can just say that. I'm not exactly sure. You know, that's nothing wrong with that.
No. Yeah.
I think the key might be is that you have a gauge on the Red River, say at Crookston, where if it gets to a certain height, you would not release water. You also have a gauge at Crookston that if you hit a certain elevation, you want to release water. And you'll probably have some other points just immediately downstream of Pine Lake damage centers that if you have flooding there, you won't release any water. So there could be, you know, hundreds of different combinations.
Well, I think that's pretty much the method that we use.
The trigger
right now.
points.
Yeah.
Yep, trigger points.
Yeah, that explains it really. I mean, that's how we're trigger points.
And you have, and that's where, all them trigger points have to determine your operating plan, your, so, that all, it's a process that gets through again with, you know, further engineering, further studies that really answer some of those questions.
And so really, this is a summary of whether you're talking about the outlet of Pine Lake or upstream storage. You can read that for yourself. There are benefits locally, watershed-wide, and that's really what was presented to kind of at the preliminary stage here a couple months ago. And I guess at this point, there's certainly questions, comments, and any other discussion.
If you were to store, this all happened, if you were storing it, in my particular, it would be between 1 and 2. When you're storing, is it going to affect the river level between the two? Or when you're releasing, is it going to increase the water level?
Like the Lost River?
Yeah, everything on mine affects, Lost River affects me and both of these.
That is very difficult to answer without some sort of, you know, I don't know where you're talking, I don't even know what project we're talking about.
I would be totally between 1 and 2. And 1 and 2 both affect me where you store it, but also every inch between, just about every inch between the two affects me. And what I'm wondering, are you going to spread that water? I mean, we have enough problem with it spreading out on normal, like the big rainfall we had here a while back in spring, and I expect that. But is that going to affect me when you're storing it or when you're letting it go?
Till we had a project specific, I know you're not gonna like this answer, we don't know, yet, but we would definitely, if we ever got to a point where we had, we were gonna determine that we're gonna start a project here, I think this is a good spot for a project. Then we get into, well, how high is the water? It might only be able to be stored this side or this side, we don't know that. So specifically to your question, I don't know, geographically where you live, elevation wise, I don't even know what elevations we're talking about storage in. So I can't, till we get a project developed or at least some concept of where we have elevations or where we even have the actual zoomed up area that says, here's what we possibly could store. We could answer that question then, but we're not at that point yet at all, where we can really get into any scientific data of where it's going to be. We really don't know anything. This is a concept of where he put these dots on the maps and said we could possibly store one here because of the topography. But I don't know.
How far does the project get going before you can stop?
Well, it's a long process to even get to the front door.
No, I realize that, but if you don't, in my case,
In
my case, I don't want it at all. To me,
Right.
it adversely affects me on all fronts. So
But we don't know that yet, do we?
I'm sure I do.
Okay. Because I don't.
I do.
Okay.
It's gonna flood my pasture, both the retention areas, and if it raises in between, it's gonna adversely affect me.
But
I'm just talking for me, I'm not talking for anybody else. But I don't wanna get.
And that's the direct that runs through my place, had a travel easement from the Minnesota DNR. And if I'm reading that, that can be flooded in a day, we have to give approval.
Yeah, if there's a trout stream, I'll guarantee you that's going to be a very sensitive area for any type of impoundment. I'm not saying that there's something that through the project work team, through EDA, through the discussion with the agency folks, because a trout stream is very high on the protected status of the
People from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, biologists, that were out there wanting to check for fish, were they anyhow involved in this project?
No.
And then just
MPCA.
right before they had a pickup with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency logo on, and they said they were there to check the fish in the Lost River.
Well, they don't like the Red Lake watershed usually.
I can honestly, on a stack of Bibles, tell you, they wouldn't even know that we're even here talking about this.
I think for us to pull
Let them have a question, they come out here and then I get this notice in the mail.
It's funny because the MPCA usually isn't a fisheries issue.
Well, that's what I asked them, why
Their
don't they
water
check for
quality.
fish? And then I told them they could check for fish, but they couldn't do anything else.
If it was recent, it could be part of the rest.
Oh, the wetland restoration and protection. That's a whole separate issue. We have a study going on in the Clearwater Sun watershed right now. We're doing a wetland restoration, what is the RAP stand? Watershed restoration, protection program for wetlands. So what they're doing is, MPCA is going all over the whole Clearwater County, looking at water quality and looking at the standards that the state sets down for water quality standards. And if they have a trout stream that they're looking at how healthy that trout stream is based on the water quality standards. Totally nothing to do with this project. However, it would be some tool that would be used in any development of any types of these projects. Because if they come and say, well, we got a very healthy trout stream here, and any adverse effects to elevations could impact that trout stream, that's all the stuff that we talked about at this project team level with agencies, and that's exactly the stuff that's being used. But thank you, Dan, because that's probably what you were seeing. It's a whole different study that's being done for water quality that we're doing in conjunction with the MPCA and the Clean Water Fund. It's a contract through the watershed district that we're doing it, but it's totally something separate than flood damage reduction. We do a lot of things in the watershed, and that's one of the things, water quality studies all over our watershed. Guy in the back there.
Does the crest occur at Crookston and recede well before the Pine Lake water gets there? Pine Lake?
Engineer question.
No, it's, the crest and Pine Lake water coincide almost perfectly.
They do?
Yeah. That's that graphic I was showing you, that's the middle, that water, in the middle of the district, hits the peak at Crookston right at the peak. So this is a strategic area, but it's a broad swath of the entire district that has that same pedigree.
In 1997, the snow around here at the Lost River where I live hadn't even melted, and the Grand Forks flooded. So I don't know if you can be completely accurate.
97 flood.
Grand Forks had flooded and the snow was still deep and the river hadn't rose at the Lost River by my place.
Yeah, Grand Forks flooded a lot from the water from the south at that in 97. It flooded from the river.
That was an unusual situation. The water was already flowing and they had that late blizzard, whatever they call it. And
That was 8%.
that was just an unusual situation. We had ice dams on our roads in my area. I'm in the, we're just kind of flat in the valley. and the water's running over the road, it's a big hill, and then we got the blizzard, and you drive over this big hump, and that was water running underneath the snow over the road, and it's all flat.
And then we got rain.
This is strange.
Rain on top of that.
I think it was 23 below and it was 7.
What, different line of question, I'm a township supervisor too, and two of our roads will probably be affected. One is real close to where Billy Clancy was talking. If I'm reading the map right, I try to look at as close as I can, and then there's one by, Amy, used to be a town, but looks like that, first site could back up that far. Is there, from a supervised position, are the roads going to be, I would guess, would be taken care of?
Hypothetically,
Myron,
that's all.
can you repeat the question
Yeah.
just briefly, because I didn't catch one tenth of it.
You can hear you.
And the question is, if the township road was impacted through flooding of water, what is the mechanism in place for the township to be able to utilize the road? Is that?
Well, or if there needs to be repaired.
Okay, if there needs to be repairs, good question. That's a very good question. All the infrastructure would, if, let's hypothetically say we had a project that we had to raise a township road. And because, there's a swale in it, we got to raise it by 2 feet. The project pays for that. They pay for the whole construction of that road, and then they pay for the structure under the road. And it's maintained as part of the project. If there has to be backwater, there would have to either be, number one, agreements made that we make, that there could be, depending on if they're, emergency routes, if they're school bus routes, where provisions may have to be made that the township road that's farther upstream may have to be raised by 1 foot or 2. That would be paid for by project. But all that stuff, hypothetically, would be all worked out in the details once the project is defined. And all that stuff has to be addressed.
Future maintenance is the responsibility of the governing body of the government.
The future maintenance is usually, if it's part of the flood damage reduction project, the maintenance could be part of the project. It has to be spelled out in the details. It could be part of the project, future maintenance. And it'd be no different than mowing the grass on the impoundments. You may have to, if you have some water damage on the road from the impoundment, the project would be maintaining that. If that answers your question in hypothetical terms.
I think it was brought up in the May 8th meeting that for just the water quality issue of Pine Lake, that you would just need about 2,000 acre-feet. That's what you might lose through evaporation through a summer, potentially. So that's what you would need to replace just for the water quality issue, is that correct?
I don't remember the number, but you probably know better than me, because I have never looked at this project as a project just for Pine Lake. Pine Lake is a project that was brought to our attention, the flashiness of that lake, and that was one component that would see an effect, obviously, directly from these projects. I'm looking at more of the holistic Red River Basin, and I do know that Pine Lake is flashy, and it's flashy in value transportation. If it's no rain, it's going to evaporate rather quickly, and it's going to go down just from evaporation. And I think you guys seen that last year on Pine Lake, where there was no rain to replenish, the aquifers, and just it evaporates. If you guys know how big Red Lake is, the upper and lower Red Lakes, and you've seen the outlet structure, there's more evaporation that occurs on Red Lakes and goes through that structure in a normal year, just from evaporation. That's a daunting task. When you look at that little structure that's at the outlet of the Red Lakes, and you look at that big body of water, more goes up in the air than through that outlet structure. No different to Pine Lake.
I think Nate made the comment that it's 2 feet of evaporation on normal, and somebody in the audience said 1,200 acres, so that's where the 2,500
Okay,
feet.
I missed that part of it.
But I don't think you would plan on augmenting all of that evaporative loss. You would have some portion of that, and that would come out of any sort of collaborative agency process. I mean, I would say more on the 500 feet would be 500 acre feet would be more of a reasonable limitation pool. 2,000, that's like literally one of those sites.
Any other questions, scenarios? Any questions from the board, from the audience?
No, I think I kind of like the way you summed it up. I think people have the idea that we're trying to do something just for the Pine Lake people. You know, I think it's more the Red River, the flood damage reduction. They come in as a component, maybe started an inkling why we got together to do some of these things, but I don't have a place on Pine Lake, and I don't think anybody else can afford it.
I've been in the watersheds for 11 years, and I have, a lot of our guys are always here looking at Pine Lake and managing it. I can honestly say, other than when I went to visit Mr. Tom Jones there when he helped design our office, I hadn't even seen Pine Lake yet. And I've seen it 3 times now.
Tommy Jones.
Tom Jones, there he is.
Okay, I thought he was a singer.
Yeah, he said that when we hired him.
Yeah, that's right. But I think that this is a good way to get some questions out, and give some thought back to us as far as, is it worth even putting together some money for a feasibility study to do anything here, you know?
Our website is redlakewatershed.org. You can go on and look at any projects that we have. You can contact our office. If you don't have our numbers, we can surely get it for you. Probably put it up as quick as anyone here.
I just got one question. Those numbers on those sites are correlated. They could be mixed up.
Yeah, they're just strictly where you put his dot that day.
Yeah.
And it can be, like I said,
numbers any way
he can do it in any part of the watershed or any part of that sub-watershed.
Well, and that's the first reaction is somebody that's out there is, well, these guys are gonna come in, they're gonna take this, they're gonna do all these things, but actually in reality, for us to do any projects, there's a lot of hoops for us to get through as far as whether it be the trouts, whether whoever may be through.
We had a project, 2 projects that was like a record, and it was part of the Governor Plenty's Clean Water Initiative. The Grant Euclid, East and Palmer, one of them we showed. We got that done from the first landowner meeting to construction was 2 years, and that was fast.
And I think that it's nice for the people to know that Gene farms in the area right around the Euclid impoundment and the Brandt impoundment.
I got a little story with the Euclid East one. I got a letter in the mail that my property in Euclid Township was going to be part of an impoundment. It was a mistake, I found out, because that's where my house is. And then I was up in arms and voted for Bear, and I went to a meeting, and then it ended up being in Belgium, which is the next township, which I actually own some property that's in the impoundment there. But, so, that's how I got involved with watersheds.
You're not saying you
This is
were
where I
happy
am,
because
this
of
is where,
this.
no, I am happy. And that's how I got on this board, is I started opening them up.
It's very important to get landowners, if you're even thinking of something in an area, the best thing is to get landowners in front of you first. And that's what we've tried to do with these 2 meetings, with landowner meetings. Exactly what Gene, the project was well underway, one of them before Gene even heard about it back in the day. So things were done a little differently back then. We were trying to do, I can't say I was part of that, by the way, so just to clarify.
That was Parnell.
That was Parnell, you're right.
That was involved.
So anyway, you get the landowners in front of us first, have a discussion. We've already heard of sensitive areas, and trust me, there's going to be a lot stricter people than us looking at these projects for sensitive areas. Because sensitivity is in the eye of the beholder. When you get in the environmental landscape, they're pretty defined, and they know what sensitive and what isn't. So, and then Terry?
I'm very sensitive to this, and you all know that. I've communicated that. For me to give up potentially 25 acres of hardwoods, and from here to where I live, we've got, since 1997, thousands of acres of tiling and drainage. This seems like a very minute effort when you think of what have changed since the tiling and everything that's going on closer to Crookston, Oakley, Mentor. I drive that area all the time. that makes me feel like I'm giving up a lot.
I'll give you an example, and if we want to talk about tile, we could be here for a long time, because there's a lot of stories on tile. That it could be for flood damage reduction, it could actually help with flood damage reduction, so
I think,
there's studies that
I think
show
we've
it.
heard that way quite a little.
And so there's a whole host of things that go that way. You look at that 11,000 acres of feet of storage that's just thrown up there randomly. We built, you say it's a little bit, but we're already doing these things, and we built 3 impoundments that have total about 11,000 acre feet of storage for 3 of them.
Yeah.
So this is not uncommon to what we've already done in other parts of our watershed district. And we have a huge watershed district, 6,000 square miles, largest in Minnesota.
And I
So
think
every little bit helps.
maybe to touch on the Sheriff Dam, what that small impoundment there did.
Yeah, so you know our friend. Anyway, yeah. The Sheriff Dam that Dale was referring to was one of our first structures completed in 1997. That actually saved the city of Crookston from flooding because of the timing, and your crew was out there operating those gates at that time. So I mean, they work. I mean, when they're needed, they work. They work this year. There's a lot of landowners pretty happy to see that storage 2 miles away from their place when they could have been their field with that 6 inches of water on it right now for a while. So just we're not. This isn't like the first. And you've seen it. We have them all over right now, and we're still we're doing our due diligence to look at other areas, and this happens to be one of many that we're going to look at. So.
Are there other areas you're looking at that are this far along in the process?
This was our first informational meeting since we did the study.
Okay. All right. So are there other sites besides the 3 that were up on screen that are under consideration?
Oh, definitely.
Right.
There's quite a few places right now that, like we got this last fall, I think, from Nate, this study that you guys are seeing right now. So we're 7 months into it, 6 months into it. So it's an infant to us to absorb what we have to accomplish. So to answer your question, is there's going to be lots of landowner meetings in our watershed district. We've had lots of landowner meetings prior to this study because we've already built just in the last 5-6 years 7,000 acre feet of storage, or 8,700 acre feet of storage. So we've already had these meetings. So this isn't the first time we're not picking on anyone.
So what does the process look like here? Is there going to be a feasibility study and then a vote on a project? Is that reversed? What does the specific process look like for this?
Hypothetically, if the board was going to proceed with anything, we would have to have some sort of feasibility study to see what kind of, just general impacts. Because right now we know nothing. We know nothing other than what some of the landowners are saying, but we don't even know the elevations of anything we're talking. So I can't say it's going to be in his pasture because I have no idea where his pasture is. I don't know what the elevation is. I don't know what the pools are. So we can't, we have to have way more information that would in turn give us more data to be able to answer some of these questions that are here from a specific. What we're here to try and do is just kind of throw you the process, and without getting into specifics of how it's going to affect your land, I have no idea.
So by the time the board were to vote on making something a project, they would have very, very specific ideas about exactly what they were. They could tell you within the acre what they were voting to approve.
Would a feasibility study get you within an acre foot?
Yeah, conceptually, sure.
Okay.
Preliminary or final.
And then once you even got that point, then you bring in we haven't even got our project teams in, we haven't even got our agencies in and said, hey, you can't touch this spot, you can't touch this spot. So this is just to get an idea of what the water's going to look like out there without even knowing. Although there's tools now that tell you a lot of the impacts in our natural resource enhancement issue. They have these little tools out there that tell you if there's strategic protected areas that they don't want to get touched. You first, then we'll come back.
Oh, yeah, thank you for all the information, really appreciate it, and the hard work of the board. But there are landowners, of course with the river you've got landowners with land on both sides of the river. And so while you're in this process, you know, it's kind of a cloud hanging over our heads, trying to figure out, you know, what's gonna happen. So in your process that you're doing, to get a project going would probably take longer than if you decided not to do a project. You could let those landowners know sooner, couldn't you? To help them kind of remove that cloud that's kind of over them.
Well, I think that's something that'll come up with a discussion on the board meeting after we've met with landowners and all interested parties. The board then would have discussion and vote whether we proceed with the feasibility study or not. And if that doesn't go forward, I think that would be public knowledge that we aren't pursuing any interest in the area.
It would be public knowledge whether we decided or not to go with feasibility. So if the board decided to go to feasibility study, I mean, we would definitely, you know, let the folks know that we're gonna proceed with the feasibility study or not. So that you at least know, okay, now we go to the next step, which is still a long ways away from the project. I mean, it's unbelievable how a project, we had, on these two impoundments that were built in 2008, we had 5 sites located. After we had landowner meetings, agency meetings, purpose and need statements developed, we got to 2 sites. You know, so it changes a lot in these meetings. The whole project changes almost entirely. You know, we thought the one site was the best site, and it turned out it wasn't. After we started doing more work and more research and more hydraulics and
you may find that there are people that are interested. There's people that are opposed. They're usually the ones that come and say, but when you get out to do the feasibility, there are people that come out that don't mind these projects at all either. But I mean, they're the ones who probably aren't here tonight.
We had the landowner meeting at the Yukon East Department. We had it in our office. There was 30 people there. And we were talking, you know, at this landowner meeting, and there's one guy who was sitting real quiet for the whole meeting. Didn't say much of anything. And after probably about an hour into the meeting, when he raised his hand and he was talking a little more about compensation and stuff, and he goes, well, I happen to own the land where the water comes now, and it sits there, affects my crops, I might as well get paid for it. And that was, you know, he finally, you know, said, you know, it already comes here. He already gets flooded out. He's fought it for years, and now I might as well get compensated for it. And he's one of the guys that's farming in the impoundment, not the one that you've seen on here, because it's a different impoundment.
But I think what you see when you, I mean, we've dealt with a lot of issues in the watershed in the 17 years I've been here, and you'll get somebody that's hyped up on something, they're gonna get everybody involved and this and that. That guy might be saying they would like to, but he's not gonna fly into that hornet's nest that night. He's just gonna be quiet, he's got neighbors around there. Pretty soon, maybe he would be interested as we continue on, you know, and that's usually the case with most of the projects.
But like you say, the landscape of the projects change all the time. I wouldn't be, yeah, I think to recap it, even if they proceeded with a feasibility study, that's just a study. There's going to be a lot of issues. There's going to be a lot of changes to anything that may or may not go. So, you know, we'll keep you posted. This isn't going to be, no matter, you know, if it proceeds, there's going to be more landowner meetings. I'll guarantee you that.
And that's kind of what opens the door for the
next step? The feasibility study.
I think the board goes back and has discussions on whether they feel that this area is, could be useful for at least a feasibility study to determine if there's enough bang for your buck, so to speak. And that can even change. They may think
Was that like a month, 2 months, a year? What are we talking?
Within a month.
I would say within a month.
Within a month.
I would guess that would be.
There might be some more questions we want with our engineer as well too before we kick off. I mean, when we kick off the feasibility study, doesn't necessarily say we have the project either. So, I mean, we want to use due diligence with our money as well as the taxpayers to see that we can succeed in a spot as well, you know.
Right, and I know you guys aren't concerned about this, but any of these projects that get funded is exclusive. You know, we don't go after a special levy to the landowners like a ditch project if you're doing a legal drainage system or anything. So there, you're not going to see any bump in your taxes because of a project that goes up. We all know everything is built with taxpayers' dollars, but you're going to have people from all over the state helping pay for these types of things because it's a benefit to the people of Minnesota, especially the Red River Valley. So yeah, that funding tool is pretty much in place. And then, like David mentioned, the new farm programs that are intact now that the federal government put $50 million a year for, and an additional 20 for 5 years into farm programs that can help the landowner augment costs or augment, so he gets compensated more for their property through these type of things. It'll be farm program oriented, so.
Well, any other questions? Otherwise, I think we're gonna make a motion to adjourn the informational
Do
meeting.
you have a map specific with the sites, land actually affected, is big enough so you can actually read it?
We really don't, we haven't.
We'll get glasses for you and Trent when we get to that point.
Well, I think the one site's right by me, but I can't tell for sure.
Yeah.
Right, well, we don't know either.
No, either.
We put a dot on the map, that dot's gonna change. I'll guarantee you, even if you could magnify glass to see where that dot is, it's gonna change.
I think there'll be more
If it
detail
goes
when we get to
anywhere.
that point.
That's what the feasibility study will.
And say you decide to go on a feasibility study, and you send some fool up to my place, and I say you can't set foot on here, then what do you do? You don't know, but I'm sure you
Well,
will know.
Wow, I can answer that.
You have the right to go on property.
So
If
they
it's
can
a
go on my
project-
property without my permission, but
If it's a
Oh,
project.
you-
We would
you'd be notified.
clearly call you.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we'd let you know.
We're not gonna just go out and show out.
I don't think,
Still, you're taking away my property rights, you let people roam around here without me saying they can be on here, I don't know.
well, that'd be a whole different subject that we're not gonna get into tonight with you.
We aren't there yet.
No.
We don't even know if we got to be on any project.
Yeah. We'll cross that bridge when the day comes, if indeed we do. Ma'am, you have one question?
Well, I was just, we were talking about the spots on the map, and I was just looking at, 1, 2, 3, those were just the sub-watersheds within there, correct? Those were not the specific project sites, they were just indicating the specific watersheds in which each of those projects resided.
That's exactly right.
But I think what he's getting at too is we see some potential levees and dikes in there, and I think what he's asking is where are those actually situated? I mean, they're obviously put on a map there. I mean, you have
I think
some.
they could zoom up to that map and show you, here's where I put my dot. But that, again, that was to try and get some, because that model gives you acre feet of storage. So he could have that dot wrong by 2 miles or a mile, but he did do the one dot.
But that's not necessary with the line item. They can surely get closer than that.
He knows where he is on his, he knows where that dot is.
That's what he wants to know.
Yeah.
You want to know where the dot is now? That
Where
dot?
are you planning on building these things? What is such a hard?
Well, I don't think we're to that point yet. I think we were logging along pretty good here. I mean, we know they're within a certain amount in area there and the indications. I mean, do we have does that detail a section? No. We wouldn't be able to give that out at this informational meeting.
I guess that is my question too, and I'm the one that, you have a slide up there that goes back to the old print on this last meeting. So the shaded areas where it shows the retention is gonna be, that isn't exact at all.
Not that exact at all. That's just a hypothetical dot that he put on the map that shows where water would store if we were going to do a project in that area.
I mean, to me, it looks like there's a line in front of each one where there's gonna be a dam, so that's not right either, it's just.
Well, that would be the theoretical, if we put a dam here, this is where the water would back up.
But that isn't necessarily where it's gonna go.
No, that's the extent of it, it's one click of a mouse. I mean, that this information was completely preliminary, not even feasibility. These projects, as Myron said, would look entirely different based on landowner and agency input.
To me, that.
I think what we need to do is it's gonna be on somebody's land. And until we get to that feasibility study, we don't know whose land. I mean, for us to say it's not gonna be on your land or your land, we can't maybe say that tonight, but it's gonna be on somebody's land if we went forward with the feasibility study, and we had that knowledge.
Would identify more,
I mean,
more what you guys are asking from specifics.
So even if all the landowners are against it, feasibility study will still go ahead?
I can't answer that.
Well, that would be up to the board of the discussion after the hearing, after the meetings.
Yeah, just to respond to what you said earlier, so the board has somewhat of a target number of acre feet that they would like to store in those 3 sites?
Not necessarily, no.
No, there's no goal in
I mean,
sight at all.
if we get into an area that's just, that maybe there is contention there, that there's nothing wanted there, would we scale down to the ones where we could find availability of storage site? Yes. I mean, like Myron said, the 5 we went after on the one site, we got 2. I mean, we don't know that we're to the point we're not gonna, if we get in an area, there's nobody, nothing wants anything done, we know where we're at then.
Well, there was one gentleman that emailed me on the phone here today, but I said, we're in no position to make a determination whether we're gonna pull one off table, pull it on table, because we don't know enough about any of them to make that decision. Just by a landlord saying, I don't want it here. Well, that's not a reason for a 6,000 square mile area to determine it's not gonna be there. There may be other alternatives that can be made that would change the whole scope of the project to minimize the effects of the people who don't want it, but it still doesn't mean we shouldn't look at it.
And you know, there's the sites of the Brandt and Euclid are what, between 3,000 and 4,000 acre feet is worthy of doing. Are we gonna accomplish 12,000 here? Maybe not. We might accomplish 2,000 or 3,000. That's still somewhat of a start for main stem flooding.
For our 20% reduction.
Right, so I mean, we don't have a goal here, we're gonna, if we can achieve it, fine, if not, we'll get where we can.
I think Nate summed it up pretty well. It's probably highly improbable through this first click of the mouse in 3 different spots, say, hey, we got it right. Not gonna get it right, there's no way.
And then, once we did the feasibility study, then there would be meetings held with the landowners on the sites, or on the particular sites.
We're gonna get to a point that if we did have a project and it was on your property, we'd be able to go put a stake in the ground and say, here's where the water's gonna be, because that's what flow rate we need from you.
And
It isn't gonna be right here. If you want it here, maybe it's gonna be here. You know, but we are way too far away from that.
then I mean, you would have the opportunity to deal with us at that time, you know?
It seems like the flood damage reduction money would be mutually exclusive from what would help Pine Lake, because if you're going to help Pine Lake, you need to store more than 30 days. You could be storing, and that's not going to help with flood damage reduction at all.
Well, you know, like David mentioned before, we still look at local. You know, you still have local benefits to a project. And it may be not what we want as far as a public purpose project, but it still would have flood damage reduction capacity. It probably wouldn't allow us to go to the state, which in all probability, anything that just strictly was for Pine Lake we would not go to the state and say, hey, I want flood damage reduction money for a $200,000 dam. They're gonna say, what? What are you gonna store? And we'll tell them, they say, no, that's not gonna qualify. So, you know, our board would probably, in conjunction with the Pine Lake, you know, if we're talking just specifically Pine Lake, now that was your question, that would be more of a local, where the watershed district would probably put some money, because there's still a flood damage reduction component to it. But we weren't gonna go to the state of Minnesota and ask for bonding money for a $200,000 or $100,000 project.
Of course, the lower level of Pine Lake last year was present in everybody's mind, but there still would be benefits to having a bounce in an impoundment for preventing flood on the
Yes.
also.
Yes. Yeah, there's both ways. On the Pine, from Pine Lake standpoint, you know, it could be beneficial. But again, we have, as a watershed district, we're looking at, we have, you know, 7 different counties, 6 different counties represented here, and we represent upwards of 10 counties. So we have a whole area, a big area that we are looking at. And this Clearwater County happens to be one of the first times we've been in Clearwater County for these projects. We've been in Polk County, we've been in Marshall County, you know, but first time in Clearwater County is the last since May. I think it was May when we had our first meeting.
My name is Delray Sparby. I am legal counsel for the Watershed District. And kind of the whole purpose of both these informational meetings that we've had is in the past, not with this board, but you know, with prior boards, it used to be that they would initiate a project and then have a hearing, and then that's kind of the first that anybody would know of anything. This board's been very proactive to come out and give general notice that, hey, we're thinking about, you know, looking at something in your area and trying to get landowners together to give people notice, so it's not like a person feels like, hey, we got steamrolled by this, or it's already in progress, there's no way we can stop it. this is just an informational meeting to kind of say, hey, this is what we're looking at, you know, here's some of the potential things that might occur. And then if it does go to a feasibility study, that would again go before the board. We'd have hearings, everybody would be involved, you'd have more information, you'd be able to have the chance for more input. And I think we should note, you know, for the record, we did receive a letter from, is it Mr. Orman? That was written by Mr. Orman on behalf of certain landowners. We did receive letters from, I think, anywhere from 16 to 20 landowners, I believe, with statements in opposition, you know, to certain sites as far as the project's concerned. And those have all been given to the board. They've read those, and certainly those will be considered in any decision that they might make going forward. But yeah, for not having, you know, knowledge as to specific sites and everything else, it's because we're just at an extremely general stage of trying to give some notice out to everybody, so it's not the feeling that landowners are getting railroaded or steamrolled or anything. And there's a possibility that the project doesn't go anywhere.
It's a delicate balancing act for the board, and we understand that. But your comment about, you know, in a month or so we should know more, that would really be helpful, because I'm sure somewhere in your mission statement or goals is not to harm landowners as well. And whatever benefits that you're giving to some people, I'm sure you're looking at also the harm, the damage that you might be doing to other landowners who accomplish that greater good. And part of that damage is also just not knowing. So the sooner you can let landowners that would be affected know that you can take their proposal off the table would really be helpful. And the sooner and the prompter, the better, because it really, you know, in my particular case, you would be irreparably damaging probably over 100 acres and changing the use of over 100 acres of my property. And it just, to sit here and have to wait until, you know, twiddle my thumbs while you're making your decisions, it's not easy, you know. So, you know, I really appreciate that you have a tough balancing act, but the sooner we can.
Are you saying sooner we hurry up and do a feasibility study so you wouldn't have to worry anymore?
In my own thinking, it seems like sites that you realize that is not going to work would come sooner than taking and finding out the sites that would work. And part of what I'm hearing is that landowner input is an important part of what you want to hear. And so if there's a situation where you can remove a site, still meet your goals, you know, that you have, but to let those landowners know that, you know, that site is not going to be approved.
I think, you know, and that's exactly right. Even if you're modifying the site to do least impacts, it's important. I mean, so, you know, we totally get it. I mean, like I said, we've had a lot of landowner meetings since I've been around. And, you know, you got one land board member here that, how many acres do you have within the homes? A couple hundred acres, you know, so I mean, he's been there, done that. And he wasn't sitting right where you guys are at the time.
And you guys have volunteered your time. I don't know if you get reimbursed or not, but I mean, it's a very tough job that you have, and we appreciate the efforts that you're making on behalf of those that are out there. So.
Thank you. I think I'd like to close this pretty quick.
Just a sidebar for this. The money for these projects is coming to the Farm Bill. Colin Peterson got $50 million for the next 5 years to be spent for retention in the Red River Basin. But along with that, the rest of the congressmen and senators wanted to make it a federal authority. Now we have the Red River Retention Authority, which is Red River Watershed Management Board, all the watershed districts on the Minnesota side, and all the conservancy districts on the North Dakota side. If this would have been a federal authority, they would have came in here, probably hired Maine's company to decide these sites. They'd have just come out here and said, build one here, here, and here, and they went back to Washington. We fought hard, real hard, to get this a local authority, so you people can have some input and some say in where it goes, how it goes, and what's done. So, and that's what we're trying to do.
That's a good point. Thanks, Orville.
That's important.
Yeah. I think at this time, we're gonna maybe close the informational meeting. I think I'm about sauna it out in here. Someone want to make a motion to adjourn? Orville, second? Second by Gene. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Thank you.